Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to treat this session like a masterclass, university lecture, exploring the really fascinating intersection of religion and philosophy. Today, we're diving deep into a paper by Ayman Motlakarani called Wisdom and Philosophy in the Bahá'í Faith. To give you a quick summary right off the bat, this article examines how the Bahá'í writings don't just, borrow older philosophical ideas. They actually construct a completely distinct philosophical paradigm. We'll explore how this framework entirely reconfigures the nature, the purpose, and even the authority of philosophy itself, shifting it from this abstract academic exercise into a literal tool for ethical and civilizational transformation. Arani's paper brilliantly illustrates how the Bahá'í writings reconcile human thought with divine revelation. So, go ahead and grab your notebooks, and let's treat this as our study guide, because we're going to explore how this totally reconfigures the very nature of philosophy. We are moving far away from a metaphysical vision of philosophy as just mere speculation. As Arani notes, it becomes world-shaping praxis. Think of it as an active, continuous process of interpreting the world to actually build a better civilization. Okay, here is the syllabus for today's explainer tracking this bridge between reason and faith. We'll cover 1, the historical dichotomy, 2, the concept of Hikmat, 3, the axis of manifestation, 4, some intellectual case studies, and finally 5, civilizational praxis. All right, kicking things off with part 1, the historical dichotomy of reason versus revelation. To really understand this new paradigm, we first have to look at the historical tension that has defined Western and Middle Eastern thought for centuries. For hundreds of years, we've basically been trapped in this crisis of meaning between two extremes. On one side, we have the myth of Enlightenment rationalism, this idea that true philosophy has to be a purely autonomous exercise of human reason, completely divorced from any religious dogma. Then, on the other side, we have traditional theology, where human reason is strictly subordinate to unyielding religious rules. But Arani points out that this separation is actually kind of a historical illusion. Early philosophers like Pythagoras and Aristotle were deeply influenced by theological traditions. And the Bahá'í model proposes a really powerful alternative that just shatters this whole dichotomy. Which brings us to section 2, the concept of Hikmat, or divine wisdom. Let's see exactly how the Bahá'í alternative builds a bridge across this historical divide by introducing a profoundly different way to understand wisdom. If you're following along with our study guide format, you're definitely going to want to put a huge star next to Hikmat. This is the Bahá'í concept of divine wisdom. In sharp contrast to those traditional definitions of autonomous rational inquiry, where the mind just operates in a vacuum, Hikmat harmonizes rational inquiry with divine guidance. It proposes that the fundamental insights of classical philosophy actually emanated from the prophets of God in the first place. So in this structure, reason isn't blind and revelation isn't mute. Philosophy becomes the reflective face of revelation, and revelation is the animating soul of philosophy. They become this unified, dynamic force. Moving to section 3, the axis of manifestation, the ontological core. So, what exactly is the conceptual core that makes this harmony between reason and revelation even possible? How does the divine actually interact with the human intellect? The crucial realization here is that the manifestation of God isn't just a religious figure or some prophet handing down a list of rules. In this paradigm, the manifestation, or zuhur in Arabic, is the central ontological axis for all philosophical inquiry. The Bahá'í writings argue that the ultimate divine essence is completely, absolutely unknowable to the human mind. The manifestation acts as the perfect mirror, bridging the infinite divine with our finite cosmic reality. This is huge because it shifts philosophy away from endless abstract speculation about an unknowable God and instead grounds it right in the active, living realities brought by these manifestations. Building on that core, Arani outlines a really fascinating new hierarchy of knowledge. And notice how access to divine reality in this framework isn't just based on your academic credentials. It's actually based on ethical purification. At the very top, manifestations possess innate, infallible knowledge. Just below them are prophets and infallible interpreters with endowed guidance. Then we have righteous scholars, whose knowledge is sanctified by their moral purity, followed by mystic seekers who attain knowledge through spiritual transfiguration. And sitting at the very bottom, the errant philosophers, whose intellect is entirely veiled by materialism and pride. And this brings us to a pretty stark warning. What happens when autonomous reason hits a wall of human ego? Well, according to the writings, it leads to what is called satanic knowledge, an intellect that's completely divorced from humility. There's this incredibly powerful quote from Baha'u'llah that states, "Knowledge is the most grievous veil between man and his creator." Think about that. If learning leads to arrogance or endless arguing or sense of superiority, the unpurified heart actually becomes an obstacle to the very truth it claims to be seeking. That takes us to Section 4, Intellectual Case Studies, Conversions and Praxis. To ground these abstract concepts, let's look at some real-world historical figures. How did highly trained intellectuals actually integrate their profound secular training with the Baha'i revelation? This brilliantly illustrates how top-tier minds embraced this exact paradigm. Take a look at Auguste Forel, a brilliant Swiss neuroanatomist. He didn't abandon his scientific mind at all. Rather, he found that the Baha'i teachings totally harmonized the empirical rigor of Western science with the moral demands of a spiritual life. Then there's Dr. Ali Murad Dawoodi, a leading professor of Islamic philosophy at Tehran University. He took centuries of complex Islamic metaphysics and found that the Baha'i revelation realized the ultimate metaphysical unity, or tawhid, that philosophers had literally been seeking for ages. Their lives and their work prove that this philosophy is not merely apologetic. It's not just about defending a religious text, right? It is a vital, constructive, intellectual encounter. These thinkers maintained absolute fidelity to reasoned inquiry and the scientific method, but they completely reconceptualized their fields. They grounded new metaphysics, ethics, and theology squarely in the light of revelation. And finally, Section 5, Civilizational Praxis, From Words to Action. Let's see how all of this builds into an active methodology for interpreting the world, which is deeply connected to modern academic debates about language and meaning. Thinkers like Nietzsche and Foucault popularized post-structuralism, the idea that language and interpretation are merely struggles for power. In their view, there's no eternal truth, just historical artifacts and power dynamics. But the Baha'i paradigm offers a radical alternative. It views the revealed word of the manifestation not as some historical power play, but as a theophonic, creative event. The divine word actually inaugurates a totally new linguistic beginning. It literally calls new realities into being, breaking history open and reconfiguring it from the inside out. But then the question becomes, how do we interpret that word today? In the absence of a living appointed guardian, understanding sacred texts transforms into what Irani calls dialogical responsibility. The hermeneutic journey maps out like this. First, it starts with textual fidelity, anchoring our understanding in the authoritative texts. But then, it absolutely requires collective consultation. And this isn't just standard debating. It's a sacred dialogue completely purged of ego and idle fancies. Interpretation stops being the domain of some solitary, dogmatic scholar and becomes a communal act of reading, responding, and seeking unity. This is exactly how the Baha'i framework prevents interpretation from just collapsing into complete relativism. The ultimate takeaway here is that true philosophy has to transcend barren metaphysical hair-splitting. It simply cannot remain trapped in an ivory tower. As Baha'u'llah unequivocally states, academic pursuits that begin and end in words alone are essentially worthless. The love of wisdom must actually generate actionable moral insight. Reason is absolutely honored, yes, but it has to bear fruit. It has to result in the actual elevation of humanity. So let's summarize our study guide for this masterclass. The Baha'i model shifts philosophy from a passive, abstract spectator sport into world-shaping praxis and active civilizational renewal. It achieves this by recentering the manifestation of God as the ultimate truth. It seamlessly harmonizes rational, scientific inquiry with spiritual revelation. It strictly demands ethical transformation right alongside any intellectual pursuit. It replaces solitary, ego-driven dogmatism with collective, consultative understanding. And ultimately, its highest aim is the building of a unified, just global civilization. As we wrap up today's explainer, it's pretty clear that this framework completely redefines what it means to be a lover of wisdom. So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder as you review your notes. If true philosophy is not merely academic speculation, but a profound civilizational responsibility, how must we transform our own pursuit of knowledge today? How will you turn your love of wisdom into action?